Welcome to today's Table Talks. My name is Scott Kappelman, and I'm joined by my co-host, Tyce Lawbinger. Tyce, how are you?
I'm doing great.
You had a busy week?
I have. Well, this week's been good.
Okay.
It's been a little busy, but not bad.
Brooklyn's had the busy week.
Brooklyn's had a very busy week.
She works at a research center for
Yeah.
Mississippi State, and they study cows, and
Yeah.
they've had a lot going on,
They have, yeah.
apparently.
Yeah.
Because you said she's had to go to work early.
Yes, there was Monday. She left about 4:30 and got back about 7:30.
That's a long day.
That is a very long day.
Wow.
So
I'm impressed with her diligence to her job.
yeah, so am I.
That's good.
I'm very happy for it. So yeah,
That is not you.
No, yeah, agreed. Yeah, this week we have no church Wednesday or Sunday, so it's been.
Yeah, with fall break.
Yeah, I've been able to do other things.
We're recording this on a week where at Mississippi State it's a fall break week as well as the local schools. And so it does change our strategy of what we do here in Starkville in the church circles.
Yep.
So it's a light week, as we would say.
Yeah.
Which is good.
It is good.
So all right, so today for our table talk, we're going to go and talk about the sovereignty of God. And this kind of flows out of something you did Sunday night.
Yep.
We're going through with our college students in college worship who God is. And we talked about the omnis of God. He's omnipotent. He's omnipresent. He's omniscient. And then I added omnigrace. And then the second week we talked about his holiness. But this past weekend, you talked about his sovereignty.
I did, yeah.
And that's a big topic.
It's a huge topic.
And I was happy that you chose it because I didn't have to do it.
Yeah.
And we all kind of divided up these topics. You chose the sovereignty of God. And now do you look back and think, what was going on in my mind?
I do, because I learned some things, obviously. You always learn a little bit more when you're researching.
Yeah.
But I don't think there was a net gain of what I learned for the prep that I put into it.
You put a lot of time
into
into it, not to get a lot of outcome.
So there's a net gain, I hope, for the college ministry. But
I think they enjoyed it.
So,
I think it was very beneficial. And I hope today's table talk will give people who watch an opportunity to think through what we've talked about with the college students.
Yep.
So I didn't ask you to think about this. Were there 2 or 3 resources that you used that you would recommend as good options as people do research on the sovereignty?
Yeah, so I read Olson's book. I can't think of his first name. I wanted to say Greg, but I looked at it yesterday and I knew it wasn't Greg.
I think Greg Olson was a baseball player that may have played for the Atlanta
Braves.
It was.
And so
but I thought the same thing.
Yes, so he, he's in charge of the theology program at some university. He was very good. Most of the books I read were very textbook-esque, and so they were difficult to read. But not Greg Olson's, but Olson's book was very good. And I also read some J.I. Packer, and some N.T. Wright. While I'm not the biggest fan of N.T. Wright, because his stuff is just hard, and I don't always agree with everything, Packer and Wright come from the same... They're both Anglicans. They're both in the same... I mean, they're co-theologians, I guess, but they believe different things. So I use them.
I've actually heard an interview where Wright talked about having discussions with Packer.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. They do both come out of the Anglican tradition, but they don't necessarily look at theology the same way.
Completely different.
Yeah.
So, because Packer is Calvinist at heart, and Wright is very much the opposite.
That's right.
So,
all right. So when I was thinking about the sovereignty of God before the semester started, of course, we had just had the situation where former President Trump, was in Pennsylvania, and there was an active shooter who took a shot at him.
Yeah.
And of course, it grazed his ear because he turned his head at the right moment. And there were so many posts that I saw right after that claimed it was the sovereign will of God that he not be killed.
With the ones with Jesus' hand on his shoulder, looking over him. The whitewashed Jesus, too.
That's right. And that, God caused his head to turn at just the right moment. And so that raised a lot of questions about what do you believe about the sovereignty of God? Now, the flip side of that is there was a guy sitting behind him who took a bullet and died, and his family's still enduring a season of grief.
Yeah.
And so if you take the approach in the sovereignty of God, that God caused Trump's head to turn at just the right moment, then you have to also assume that God wanted the man behind him to die in that moment, which is a very tough thing to think about.
It is
And so I just think this whole concept of the sovereignty of God, it creates a lot of discussion. And I thought you did a really good job of helping us kind of sort through it. So in a general sense, how would you define the sovereignty of God?
Well, yeah, so I would just describe it as his absolute authority and right to rule.
I would agree.
So,
I think that's a great way to say
yep.
it. His absolute authority and right to rule. And as the creator, that gives him, because he created the earth
He did.
and what we see,
Yep.
that gives him the right to be the ruler
Yeah.
over everything.
Yeah.
And you had two passages that you used. One was from Genesis chapter 1, and we could read the whole chapter, but we won't. But I will read Genesis 1, verse 1, just as a reminder. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And so by being the de facto person who created everything, he has the right to rule over it.
Yep.
And then we know Jesus, it's so hard for our minds to comprehend the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit being one. But the same is said about Jesus in John 1, because there's a parallel.
Yeah.
So if you want to read John 1, verses 1 through 5, I think you had that in your notes from Sunday night.
Yep. So, like you said, John 1, starting verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and all things were made through him. And without him, not anything that was made was made. In him was life, and there was life in the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome it.
And what I always say, and we talked about this several weeks ago, whenever we have a disciple of Jesus and like Paul also agreeing with that, and we find in Colossians chapter 1, it kind of confirms for us everybody in the New Testament saw the same thing.
Yes.
Jesus is the creator, and Paul confirms that himself. In Colossians 1, he's the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For everything was created by him in heaven and on earth, the visible and the invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and by him all things hold together. And so I guess the witness of Scripture from Genesis all the way through the New Testament is God is the creator. Jesus was a part of that creation because he's God in the flesh. And as the creator, he has the authority to rule.
Yep.
So anything else you'd add on that front?
No, he really is king and creator. So when you are the creator, and as we see in John 1, that he has the power over it, because he is all the omnis that you mentioned earlier.
Yes.
When you're not only creator but have power to change that creation, that is your absolute right to rule.
That's right.
So,
and then you went beyond this in your talk on Sunday night, and I want to kind of let you hit this, but there are things that God in the Scripture shows his sovereign rule over. And you had a whole list for us. And so if you want to run through that list, I think that would be really good.
Well, yeah. So I think you have my list actually written down. So
okay, yeah, I do. It's
if you want to go through it, and then I can mention why I put them in there.
Okay, let's do that. Let's do that. That's a great thing. I just scribbled them down because I thought they were so good. So he's over nature.
Yep.
And you used Noah.
Yes. So we see, obviously we could go to Genesis again. Genesis 1, and just say over, he created it, but he actually actively works on it after created.
Right.
And so we see the flood coming. And not only did it rain for the first time, he opened up the heavens, but we also know that the earth shook and it split open and water burst forth from the ground.
Right.
So that is just changing nature in so many ways, whether it be just tectonic plates and continents shifting during that time, or just water coming up out of the ground. God is actively over nature and can do what he wants with it.
And I think it's real fascinating when you're able to go back and do a little research and find one of those images of the Hebrew worldview.
Yeah.
Where there's water above and there's water beneath and the earth is in the middle. And so they knew there was this water above, but during the flood it falls.
It does.
And it begins to rain. And so as you said, God's over all that because he's the one who spoke all of that into existence. So he's over nature. He's over health. And I really like this because you use David when he and Bathsheba have committed the sin of adultery.
Yep.
They conceive a child, and God announced through Nathan the prophet, this child's going to die as a result of your sin. But David goes before God and pleads for the child's life, knowing that health, his very health, is held in the hands of God.
Yeah.
Any thoughts about that?
Well, and that's one of those harder things because you get in this mindset of, well, God caused the sickness, but it was out of a punishment. It's not just God causes every sickness, but it was this is David's punishment. And so God caused the sickness, but then David actively pleading with God. And once the child dies, he ultimately says, well, why should I continue to fast? Why should I continue to cry? God made his choice. I had my opportunity to plead with God, but God is ultimately in charge. And David surrenders that to God. He doesn't get mad at God. He doesn't turn away or just lead his entire people, the nation of God, away from God. He's just, hey, this is God's choice, and God is sovereign over the situation.
And I've used that passage several times when there's been a death of a child in a church that I've served, to say that as we move forward, whether it's the immediate family or the church family, we will all have to do some things that we would consider unnatural. Yep. And that's what David did. He gets up, he takes a bath, he puts on some fresh clothes, he goes and eats a meal, which he's not eaten for some time because he's been fasting and praying. And then he goes to God's house and worships. And all of those things in the moment were unnatural. But it does show us that David clearly understood the health of the child was in the hands of God, because he sovereignly is over that.
Yes.
So the next one you had was angels. I'll let you share a little bit about that.
Yeah, so there's a couple instances we see in the gospel of God using angels. First, we have just in Luke 2, where the messengers are sent. And if you're a king, you obviously have the ability to send people out to do what you need them to do. So the messengers came. And then when Christ was being led towards the cross, he says, he's telling his disciples, like, if I wanted this to stop, I could call down 12 legions of angels.
Right.
And so, I mean, that's commander in chief. So not only can he send messengers, but he can also call down an army where he is just ruler over those angels.
That's neat. And then he's over demons.
Yep.
On the flip side, you've got the angelic side, but now you've got the demonic side.
Yeah. And so, well, first off, let's just think about how great that is, that your enemy still is subject to you.
That's right. That's a great thought.
We see in Job that Satan has to go and ask, like, hey, God's bragging on his servant. Like, Job is just, look how great he is. And Satan's like, well, would he be that great if he didn't bless him? And he asks, like, hey, can I do these things to him? And God allows it. But Satan does have to ask. The adversary, the number one villain of the Bible, we see has to plead with God, asking for permission. And then we also just see Jesus, the ability throughout his ministry to cast out demons.
And that should truly encourage our hearts as followers of Jesus. Because greater is he who's in us than he who's in the world.
Yes.
Because as we see in Job, he has to answer to God.
He does.
God sovereignly rules over Satan and all of his demonic forces.
Yeah. He does. And he even has to go to God. He has to go to heaven. He just can't just like call him up and not look him face to face. Like he does have to.
And that even comes into play. And I think you mentioned this. I can't remember. I think you did Sunday night. When Jesus calls the demons, the multiple demons out of the man in the Gadarene cemetery.
Yeah.
It's the demons who ask, will you please send us to the pigs? Because they know Jesus, being God in the flesh, has authority and sovereignty over them.
Yeah, he does. Yep.
And so, again, we get a pure illustration of that, not just in Job, but in the New Testament with Jesus.
Yeah, because they know going to those pigs is better than being put in chains in Tartarus.
That's right.
So,
which has come up in a guy's Bible study that we've done recently about Satan and some of the demons being placed in eternal chains. So going to the pigs was a better option.
It was a much better option.
That's right. All right, now you've got heaven.
Yeah.
He's sovereign over heaven.
Yeah, and I use the Psalms verse, which to the Old Testament, and that's just a little bit different because there was no form of resurrection at that point. They had no concept of Jesus going to die, and so for the fact that the psalmist is writing about heaven and how God is up there, is just another instance of how we can know God's glory from that. He says in that verse that God's throne is in heaven. So obviously, where you're sovereign over, you're going to put your throne. If there's any one place that God is sovereign, it's where his throne is, which is in heaven.
I like the way you used that analogy. That was good. And then he's sovereign over people.
Yep.
And this is where you used the story of Cain and Abel.
I did. So another not bad, everything, all of it's good, but just another negative, I guess, example. But God is punishing Cain for killing Abel. And he says, you're going to be punished. First off, he again shows his power over nature, or his sovereignty over nature, saying the ground will not produce for you.
Yes.
And then he says, well, you're going to be a vagabond. And so he has to travel. Now, he is a builder of cities, but he has to travel city to city because the ground's not going to produce for him. So he has to keep moving and foraging.
That's interesting. And also in that section, and I don't know that you got into this, but the blood cries out.
The blood does cry out.
The blood of Abel cries out to God,
mm-hmm.
which shows he's sovereign over people and creation in that one phrase. Like the blood of Abel cries out as a witness against what you've done. So
yeah, because God doesn't lose that connection, even when the person died. Like he hears. Yeah,
that's a good point. And then the final one is God is sovereign over the souls of humanity.
Yep. And so I use soul and hell in this example, but it's a Matthew verse, Matthew 10:28 or 20. Is it 20 or 28? Whatever.
I had Matthew 10:28.
Yeah, and so it's why do you fear man who can kill the body when you should fear God who can kill the soul and cast it into hell? And so God is over the soul, the judgment of where your soul goes. Now, granted, we have Christ, and we have an ability, the interceder, and the way to God. But God can cast our souls in hell, and Satan is not in control of hell. That is obviously a place that God is in control, and we see it in that verse. If God's going to send him to hell, that means he's sovereign over hell, because that's his area of control.
So that brings us, I'm going to go back to the one about health and David's son, because I think this is where the next part of what we want to talk about gets really complicated and difficult. Because really, when you think about the sovereignty of God, there are going to be two options that are available to us. And the first option is that in God's sovereignty, his entire creation is disposable to him to use at his good pleasure. And that would mean he can choose some to be saved and used for noble purposes that would glorify him, but he can also use, if you take that approach, people in the same way negatively to, again, bring glory to his name. And I think, you've got David's son, but you've also got like Pharaoh is another example of where people really struggle in the tension of God's sovereignty. Did Pharaoh really have a choice to let the people go, or did God already predetermine Pharaoh was going to say no every single time throughout the plagues because he was picked for condemnation, and to achieve God's purposes, that was just his role to play?
Yeah. I would say God's never made a decision for someone. It's always God is a reactor, which sounds weird to say because he is God, and we know that he's sovereign. He has the right to rule.
Yeah.
But I would just argue that God is a reactor. So Pharaoh made his choice, his first choice.
Yeah.
And God knew that, and he said, all right, you've made that choice. Now I'm going to enact and harden your heart further.
And that's been my approach. I know we've had some college students and other adults who've been in our church in the past, and they have truly looked at Pharaoh as a individual that God created with no opportunity for repentance, no opportunity to respond appropriately to God.
Yeah.
He was created for destruction and to be the mechanism to get the Hebrew people out of slavery. And one option under the sovereignty of God would be everything in creation, because he's sovereignly over it. He has everything at his disposal to achieve his purposes and to make sure it all glorifies him.
Yeah. I would argue the same with David's son, because yes, God is the author of life and creator, but when you have sex, there's an outcome of that.
Right.
And so while that child was not formed to die, but it was the choice of David that he made, and then that was the outcome. It was a response again.
Right.
And then the same, I would argue, with Judas.
And I guess that's where I want to go with that, because as a pastor, if you've got a family that has lost a child, for me, it would be very difficult to say to them, well, God just chose that child for early death.
Yeah.
We don't understand, but that was just the role the child had to play. That's very non-compassionate. I'm not sure the right terminology there. It's just not very compassionate to say that. But if you take the true option one approach, that God is sovereignly going to use his creation for his own pleasure and purposes, then you would have to say to that family, and in David's case, like, the child was just destined to die because God chose that.
Yeah.
And that's hard.
That's
very hard. So option two is there's a grand narrative that God's working on, a grand plan. And within that grand plan, he's going to always get the plan accomplished. Yes. But we have some freedom to make some choices within that.
We do. Yeah. So I have it as absolute lordship.
Okay.
Governing towards his grand goal of his kingdom. So ultimately, everything's going to lead towards God's kingdom,
right?
In His plan. But I mean, that's what I have. So I would argue, and you can answer yes or no if this is fair, but that option is God is constantly working towards the future, with the foreknowledge of what's going to happen in the moment. And then the other option is God has a foreknowledge of what's going to happen, but is constantly working in the moment to get there. And do you think that's a fair?
Yeah, I do. I actually do think, and I do think God He knows where the end destination is, and I think His sovereignty is more visible and demonstrative in the fact that He gives us choice, and He still accomplishes.
And He still gets there. Yeah.
In one, He knows the preset decisions all the way in option one, but in option two, He's showing even more sovereignty by giving us choice to still get where He wants us to go.
Yep.
Or where His plan is to go.
Yeah.
I just think it's fantastic.
It is amazing.
Yeah.
So,
any other thoughts about the sovereignty of God today that you want to throw in there? It's a deep subject.
It is a very deep subject. It is very difficult. And I think, His sovereignty is just, that's the part that we can never fully comprehend, I don't think, just because He is so big. But there's more to it than just that, and just how He works. And I think we'll get into that in a different episode.
Because really, this is part one of a two-part episode.
Yeah.
Because you really did a good job of helping us transition into what sovereignty links to biblically. And I had not personally put that together until you brought it up. So this is really just kind of setting the stage for part two. But we both believe in the true sovereignty of God, His absolute rule over creation.
Yes.
We would probably be on the side of option two, though.
Yeah.
The grand narrative is going to be accomplished. We have some choice in the matter.
We do.
And He's still going to get us where He wants everything to go.
Yep.
Okay, that's good. So we'll stop there. We hope this has given you some food for thought. We do encourage you to come back for part two, because we're going to link God's sovereignty to the next concept that Tyce introduced last Sunday night. And I think you'll enjoy part two, and it'll tie the two pieces together real neatly and give you even more discussion to have with your friends and neighbors. We hope this has been helpful in your journey with the Lord, and that it's created some discussion for you. And we hope you'll have a great week and come back and join us for the next Table Talks.